The sneer was the first thing to land. A quick, sharp contortion of his lips, practiced and precise. It was the kind of expression that didn't just dismiss you, it erased you. Madden Sterling, a man whose only notable achievement was being born to his father, Arthur, leaned back in the ridiculously expensive chair he'd had installed last Tuesday. The chair my budget had been cut to afford. He said the words, and they hung in the air of the office I had occupied for 20 years, an office that smelled of old paper, lemon polish, and my own quiet determination. Charming, but inefficient. That's what he called my life's work. My passion projects. The beautiful, forgotten buildings I had found, the ones whispering stories from behind boarded-up windows, the architectural ghosts I had coaxed back to life. For 2 decades, I was Esme, the head of acquisitions for Sterling Hotels, celebrated, even revered, for my ability to find these sleeping beauties and turn them into the soul of our boutique chain. Madden saw them as liabilities. He saw history as a rounding error on a balance sheet. He wanted to build soulless, high-profit towers that scraped the sky and cast long, cold shadows on the very cities we were meant to be celebrating. He fired me, just like that. No plaque, no farewell lunch, not even a properly worded email from Human Resources. Just him, the sneer, and a security guard I'd known for 15 years suddenly unable to meet my eyes. It was, he explained with a wave of his hand that was meant to look magnanimous, a simple business decision, a restructuring. But I know the language of power. This wasn't a restructuring. This was an execution. If you've ever poured your soul into something, a job, a relationship, a dream, only to have it snatched away and tossed in the trash like a used coffee cup, let me know in the comments below. It really does help to know you're not just screaming into the void. He thought he was just closing a chapter. He thought he was clearing away the dead wood to make room for his gleaming, sterile forest of glass. But what Madden, in his infinite and inherited arrogance, failed to understand was that my roots ran deeper than the foundations of any building he could ever hope to construct. He had just fired the woman who had single-handedly built the very legacy he was now claiming as his own. And in doing so, he hadn't just given me a cardboard box for my personal effects, he'd handed me a blueprint for his own destruction. I decided right then, in that cold, silent moment, that I would start my own hospitality group. I would use my name, my reputation, my unparalleled network of contacts, the very things he couldn't quantify and therefore couldn't value, to secure the properties he could never touch. A year later, his flagship hotel, a monument to his own ego, became a national scandal for demolishing a protected landmark. At the same time, my latest restoration, a crumbling villa everyone had written off, won the most prestigious preservation award in the country. Now, his brand is in tatters. His legacy is a punchline. And Madden Sterling, the man who called me inefficient, is trying to buy my company. He's desperate. He thinks he can throw money at his problem. But he's about to find out that the only way he can save his family's name is to sell his controlling shares to me. He thinks this is a negotiation. He's wrong. This is a surrender. The drive home was a blur of automatic functions: turn signal, brake, accelerator. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, but the rest of my body felt strangely distant, as if it belonged to someone else. The city slid past my window, a watercolor painting smeared by a careless hand. I didn't feel anger, not yet. That would come later, a slow rising heat. Right now, there was only a profound and hollow silence, the kind that follows a massive explosion. The sound of a world ending. I parked the car in my designated spot, a privilege I'd held for 18 years, and wondered if the condo board would get a memo to have my car towed by morning. The thought was so absurd, so mundane, it almost made me laugh. I walked into my apartment, the one I'd bought after my first major success with the company, the restoration of an old maritime exchange in Baltimore. The walls were lined with books: architectural history, urban planning, biographies of obscure artisans, My whole life was curated around the celebration of things that last, things with substance and story. The cardboard box from my office landed on the hardwood floor with a soft, pathetic thud. It contained a silver-framed photo of me and Arthur Sterling, his arms slung around my shoulder, both of us covered in plaster dust, grinning like idiots in the shell of what would become our first award-winning hotel. It held a collection of antique doorknobs I'd salvaged over the years, a chipped coffee mug that said "World's Best Deal Finder," the detritus of a life I no longer had. I sank onto my sofa and stared at the box. The numbness began to recede, replaced by the first tremor of pain, a deep seismic ache that started in my chest and radiated outwards. 20 years. I had given my entire professional life, my creativity, my loyalty, to Arthur Sterling's vision. And his son had wiped it all away in less than 10 minutes. It's a debatable choice, I know, to stay at a place for so long. Friends had told me for years that I should have left, that I was the brand, not the company. They'd watch as my mind started to drift back, not as a gentle reminiscence, but as a frantic search for evidence, for clues I had missed. I was a detective at the scene of my own murder, dusting for fingerprints. I remembered Arthur, not the titan of industry the magazines wrote about, but the man himself. I was just a junior analyst back then, barely 25, with a degree in historic preservation that most people in the corporate world considered a quaint hobby. He'd found me in the basement archives, where I'd been sent to categorize old property deeds. I was supposed to be digitizing them, but instead I had them spread out across 3 tables, cross-referencing them with old city maps and newspaper clippings. I was tracing the lineage of a forgotten textile mill on the edge of the city. He didn't ask what I was doing. He just pulled up a stool and asked what I had found. For an hour, I talked, and he listened. He didn't look at his watch. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he looked at me with an intensity that was both unnerving and thrilling. He said, "You see the bones, Esme. Everyone else sees the rot, the decay, the liability. You see the bones." A week later, he created the head of acquisitions position for me. We bought that textile mill. It became the Weaver's House, our most profitable hotel for a decade. Our relationship was a strange and wonderful apprenticeship. We'd spend weekends driving through Rust Belt towns and forgotten coastal villages. We'd crawl through dilapidated theaters, cobweb-filled warehouses, and abandoned courthouses. He taught me about finance, about leverage, about the cold calculus of business. I taught him about history, about narrative, about the intangible value of a place with a soul. We were a perfect partnership, the pragmatist and the poet. Then came Madden. Even as a teenager doing a summer internship, he carried himself with an air of bored entitlement. He'd walk through our project sites, his expensive shoes getting dusty, a look of profound disinterest on his face. He didn't see the hand-carved mahogany bar we were painstakingly restoring. He saw a waste of man-hours. He didn't see the intricate mosaic floor we'd discovered under 3 layers of linoleum. He saw a maintenance nightmare. I remember one meeting, about 5 years ago. Arthur was still alive, but his health was failing. Madden was running the day-to-day operations. I was presenting a proposal for a 1920s firehouse in Philadelphia, a beautiful Art Deco building, solid as a rock, with incredible brass poles and original tin ceilings. It was a jewel. I had a whole vision for it. The hook and ladder with a speakeasy-style bar in the basement and suites designed around the old fire chief's quarters. I was passionate, laying out the financials, the projected occupancy rates, the PR value of saving a local landmark. When I finished, the room was quiet. I looked at Madden. He was scrolling through something on his phone. He looked up, a lazy smile on his face. "Charming, Esme, really. But why buy the old firehouse when we could buy the lot next to it, knock down whatever's there, and build a 40-story glass box with a rooftop pool? The ROI would be triple. Think of the efficiency." He used that word even then, efficient. To him it meant sterile, replicable, devoid of character. To him, Soul was inefficient. Arthur, looking frail at the end of the table, just shook his head slowly. He was too tired to fight him anymore. We didn't buy the firehouse. We didn't build the tower either. We did nothing. The paralysis had begun. After Arthur passed away 2 years ago, the change was swift. Madden took over as CEO, and the company's mission statement changed overnight. The annual report no longer featured glossy photos of restored cornices and reclaimed wood. It was all charts and graphs, projections of growth, and architectural renderings of buildings that looked like they could be anywhere in the world. Cold, anonymous, profitable. My projects were systematically defunded. My team was downsized. I was moved from my corner office with a view of the city's historic skyline to a smaller one, overlooking the parking garage. The message was clear. I was a relic, a charming but inefficient part of his father's old-fashioned world. My last great find, the one he mocked on the way out the door, was a property called Blackwood Manor. It was an Italianate villa from the 1880s, sitting on a hill overlooking the Hudson River Valley. It had been built by a painter of the Hudson River School, and it was a wreck. The roof was failing, the windows were shattered, and the gardens were a wild, overgrown tangle. But the bones were magnificent. It had a sweeping double-curved staircase, a library with 20-foot ceilings, and frescoes of the local landscape on the dining room walls, peeling but still visible. It was owned by an elderly couple, the Morellis. Their family had lived there for 3 generations. They were fiercely protective of it. Dozens of developers had come knocking over the years, wanting to tear it down and build McMansions. They'd been sent away, sometimes at the end of a shotgun, according to local legend. I didn't approach them with a contract. I approached them with a history book. I'd spent a month researching the original painter, the construction, the life of the house. I showed up on their doorstep with a bottle of Chianti and a folder full of old photographs I'd found at the County Historical Society. I didn't talk about money. I talked about their grandfather. I talked about the painter. I talked about honor. For 3 months I visited them every week. We'd sit in their dusty, sun-drenched parlor, drinking tea from delicate, mismatched cups. Mrs. Morelli, a tiny woman with fierce, intelligent eyes, would tell me stories about the parties they used to have, about sliding down the grand staircase on baking sheets as children. Mr. Morelli, a quiet, stoic man, would just watch me, gauging my sincerity. Finally, they agreed to sell. Not to Sterling Hotels, but to me. To my promise. They made me sign a personal guarantee, written into the sale agreement, that I would oversee the restoration myself and that the original character of the house would be preserved. It was an unusual clause, legally a bit murky, but I agreed without hesitation. It was a pact. I took the deal to Madden. He laughed, out loud. He held the proposal in his hands like it was a dirty diaper, a crumbling money pit with a legally binding sentimentality clause. Are you kidding me, Esme? This is a business, not a charity for old houses. He vetoed the project on the spot. He said it was the final straw. My obsession with these passion projects was holding the company back. That was a month ago. And now, sitting on my sofa, staring at the box, the full weight of it all came crashing down. He hadn't just fired me. He had betrayed the Morellis. He had spit on a promise I had made in his company's name. The anger finally came. A white-hot, silent rage that burned away the shock and the pain. It wasn't a wild, thrashing anger. It was a cold, clarifying fire. It forged something new in the wreckage of my career. Resolve. I stood up and walked to my desk. I pulled out a fresh legal pad and a pen. I wasn't just unemployed. I was free. Free from the PowerPoints, the synergy meetings, the soulless corporate jargon. Free from Madden's sneer. He thought he had taken everything from me, But my real assets weren't on the Sterling Hotel's payroll. My real assets were in my head and in my phone, my reputation, my network, my knowledge, and my promises. The first tremor of a new idea began. A company built not on efficiency, but on trust, not on glass towers, but on solid foundations. This wasn't about revenge. I told myself that, and I almost believed it. It was about preservation. It was about proving that the things that last, the things with soul, are the only things worth building in the first place. For 3 days, I let myself fall. I ordered takeout. I didn't eat. I watched old movies I didn't see. I let the grief wash over me, the sheer crushing weight of 2 decades of my life being devalued and discarded. The phone rang occasionally, a few former colleagues, calling with hushed, nervous sympathy. They spoke in code, careful not to say anything that could get back to Madden. I could hear the fear in their voices. They were still inside the machine. On the 4th day, the fog began to lift. It was a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but some instinct made me pick up. "Is this Esme Thorne?" The voice was frail, but clear, with a faint Italian accent. It was Mrs. Morelli. My stomach twisted. I had been dreading this call. I had to tell her the deal was off, that the company had restructured, that my promise was now worthless. Before I could form the words, she spoke again. "I am so sorry to hear you have left the company, my dear. We were so worried. How did you know?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "That boy," she said, her tone dripping with a patrician disdain that could wither steel. "Madden. He called us yesterday. He said you were no longer with them and that he was now handling the Blackwood Manor acquisition personally. He offered us double what you did, said he would fast-track the sale. Cash, no conditions." I closed my eyes. Of course he did. He saw a quick asset flip, a way to get the land, tear down the house, and ignore the promise. "What did you say?" I asked, my heart pounding. "I told him the soul of our house was not for sale," she said simply. "Not to a man like that. We told him the deal was with you, or it was with no one. That is what I am calling about, Esme. Is the deal truly dead?" And there it was. The spark. The catalyst. It wasn't a call from a high-powered CEO or a headhunter. It was a call from a woman in a dusty parlor, a woman who valued a promise over a pile of cash. She hadn't believed in Sterling hotels. She had believed in me. In that moment, everything crystallized. My value wasn't tied to a corporate letterhead. It was portable. It was personal. Madden could take my office, my title, my pension. But he couldn't take the trust I had spent a lifetime building. "No. Mrs. Morelli," I said, a new strength hardening my voice. "The deal is not dead. It's just getting a new name. Give me 2 weeks." After I hung up the phone, the world felt different. The grief was gone, burned away by that cold, clarifying anger. I walked over to the box from my office, knelt down, and pulled out the framed photo of me and Arthur. I looked at his smiling, plaster-dusted face. "I'm sorry I let it get this far," I whispered. "But I'm going to fix it." I placed the photo on my desk. It felt like a sentinel. This wasn't going to be a simple revenge plot. Revenge is messy. It's emotional. This was going to be a corporate restructuring of my own design. A quiet, clinical, and total dismantling of Madden Sterling's empire, using the very principles of value he was too blind to see. My first call was to Clara Jensen. She had been my assistant for the past 3 years, a brilliant young woman with a master's in architecture from Columbia, who had taken the job at Sterling because she wanted to learn from me. She was sharp, ambitious, and fiercely loyal. Madden saw her as just another part of my inefficient team, a glorified secretary. He had no idea she was a strategic thinker, with a photographic memory for floor plans and zoning codes. She picked up on the first ring. "He's a monster, Esme. What he did was—" "I'm so sorry. I don't need you to be sorry, Clara," I said, my tone crisp and professional. "I need you to be my eyes and ears." She didn't. "I need to know what he's planning for the landmark properties we had on the long-range forecast." The old post office in Detroit. The Naval Hospital in Charleston. The ones he always sneered at. I need to know his capital expenditure strategy. I need to know who his primary lenders are for the new tower projects. It was a huge ask. It was corporate espionage, plain and simple. If she was caught, she'd be fired and blacklisted. I understand if it's too much, I said, giving her an out. There was a pause. Then I heard the quiet click of a keyboard. I'm already in the server, Esme. He just changed all the passwords, but he doesn't know I created a sysadmin backdoor 6 months ago when he started locking you out of financial reports. He's arrogant. He never checks the logs. He's arrogant. He never checks the logs. Where should I send the files? A slow smile spread across my face. He had no idea who he was dealing with. Neither of us. My next step was funding. Building a hospitality group from scratch, even a small one, requires capital. Serious capital. And while I had a healthy savings account, I didn't have the kind of money to go head to head with a behemoth like Sterling Hotels. But my network wasn't just a collection of old-world artisans and protective property owners. It included the people who financed their worlds. I booked a flight to Paris. My destination was a meeting with Jean-Luc Dubois. Jean-Luc was the CEO of a family-owned French luxury goods conglomerate, a man whose personal net worth was a rounding error in his company's annual profits. 5 years ago, I had worked with him on a joint venture. Sterling had restored a historic townhouse in the Marais district of Paris, and his company had opened one of their flagship boutiques on the ground floor. The project had been a nightmare. The Parisian bureaucracy was labyrinthine. The unions were intractable. The budget was a constantly moving target. Madden, who was supposed to be overseeing it, had thrown up his hands after 2 weeks and flown back to New York, complaining about the lack of decent burgers. I stayed. For 6 months, I lived out of a suitcase in a tiny hotel room. I learned French on the fly. I drank endless cups of espresso with city officials. I charmed union bosses. I personally oversaw the restoration of the 17th century facade. I made it happen. Jean-Luc never forgot. At the grand opening, a glittering affair, he pulled me aside. He was a man of impeccable taste and few words. He looked at the restored building, then at me. He said, "You have a gift, Mademoiselle Thorne. You do not build things. You reveal them. If you ever decide to create something that is entirely your own, my door is open." It was time to see if he meant it. I met him not in his corporate office, but in a small private museum his family maintained, a place filled with impressionist paintings and antique furniture. He greeted me warmly. He had already heard about my abrupt departure from Sterling. The world of high-end hospitality is smaller than you think. I didn't come with a sob story. I came with a business plan. A slim, elegant portfolio bound in dark green leather. I called it the Hearthstone Group. The name was deliberate. A hearthstone is the foundation of a home. It's about warmth, permanence, and a central gathering place. It was everything Madden's glass towers were not. The plan was simple, and in the current market, radical. We wouldn't compete on size or scale. We would compete on soul. We would acquire a small curated portfolio of unique, historically significant properties that larger companies deemed too difficult or too inefficient to develop. We would restore them with obsessive, painstaking detail. Our target clientele wasn't the convention-goer or the business traveler. It was the discerning, high-net-worth individual who craved authenticity and story. People like him. I laid out the first 5 potential acquisitions. Blackwood Manor was at the top of the list. Then a defunct lighthouse on the coast of Maine. A former convent in New Orleans. And former convent in New Orleans. A 19th century silversmith's workshop in Savannah. Each one was a gem. A place with a narrative that couldn't be fabricated in a marketing meeting. I also showed him the financials. This is where my foresight, or perhaps my paranoia, paid off. For years I had watched Madden's recklessness. I knew that his strategy of massive, highly leveraged new builds was a house of cards. It relied on cheap debt and a perpetually booming economy. A single shock to the system, a recession, a PR scandal, could bring the whole thing down. My plan for Hearthstone was the opposite. Lower leverage, slower growth, and a different kind of asset. I introduced him to a concept that Madden's MBA-addled brain would never grasp. Historic preservation easement transfers. It's a real thing, but deeply nuanced. When you restore a landmark, you can often get significant tax credits. But you can also place a facade easement on the property, legally preventing future owners from altering its historic character. This easement has a monetary value, which can be sold or transferred to other developers who need to offset their own tax liabilities. It's a complex, niche market. But I knew it inside and out. I had cultivated relationships with the handful of brokers and lawyers who specialized in this. It was a hidden revenue stream, a way to make preservation profitable in a way that demolition could never be. It was a plausible, if slightly arcane, financial engine for my new venture. Madden's people wouldn't even know how to begin. John Luke read the entire proposal without saying a word. He would occasionally look up at me, his eyes unreadable. When he was done, he closed the portfolio gently. He walked over to a Monet on the wall, a painting of water lilies shimmering in the afternoon. "My father taught me that true value is timeless," he said, his back still to me. "Fashion is fleeting. Style is eternal. Your former employer has forgotten this. He is building fashion. You, Mademoiselle Thorne, you are building style." He turned to face me. "How much do you need?" I gave him a number. It was ambitious, breathtakingly so. He didn't flinch, he just nodded. "I will be your silent partner. My family office will handle the transaction. There is one condition." "What is it?" "You must succeed," he said, a faint smile touching his lips. "It would be inefficient for you to fail." I flew back to New York the next day. The Hearthstone Group was no longer a dream on a legal pad. It was a funded reality. My first act was to wire the full asking price to the Morellis. The contract for Blackwood Manor was signed on their dining room table a week later. Mrs. Morelli cried. Mr. Morelli shook my hand, his grip firm and steady. He looked me in the eye and said, "We knew you were a woman of your word." That single sentence was worth more to me than my entire severance package from Sterling. Over the next year, I worked with a quiet, ferocious intensity. I was a woman building her own lifeboat while the ship she'd been thrown from sailed obliviously toward an iceberg. I kept a low profile. The Hearthstone Group was just a name on a legal entity, a shell company acquiring properties through a series of anonymous LLCs. To the outside world, nothing was happening. But in the shadows, I was assembling an army. I hired the best restoration architect in the country, a man I'd been trying to bring to Sterling for years, but who had refused to work for Madden. I hired a team of artisans, stonemasons, master plasterers, woodworkers, who valued craft over speed. I brought Clara over from Sterling. She resigned via email, giving no notice, and was at my new small office an hour later with a USB drive that contained every relevant file she had been able to download. Her loyalty was absolute. She became my head of operations. We worked out of a rented loft in a part of the city that was still gritty and real. We had IKEA desks and a coffee machine that hissed and sputtered, but the energy was electric. We were a small band of true believers, united by a common purpose. It wasn't about revenge. I kept telling myself that. It was about building something better. A counter-narrative to Madden's world of disposable architecture. While we were painstakingly restoring the frescoes at Blackwood Manor and negotiating with the Coast Guard to acquire the main lighthouse, Madden was on the cover of Forbes. He was standing in front of a giant architectural model of his new flagship project, the Sterling Grand, a 70-story tower of shimmering bronze glass in the heart of downtown. The article praised his bold, unsentimental vision and his ruthless focus on shareholder value. He was lauded as the new face of American hospitality, a maverick shedding the dusty, nostalgic skin of his father's company. Clara slid the magazine across my desk. "He looks like a Bond villain," she muttered. I just smiled. Let him have the spotlight. Seeds grow best in the dark. We focused on our work. The restoration of Blackwood Manor was slow, expensive, and incredibly complex. Every decision was a debate. Should we use modern plaster or a historically accurate horsehair mix? Could we save the original crown molding, or did we need to have it remilled? I was on site every day, making 1,000 tiny choices that I knew would add up to a coherent whole. Meanwhile, Clara was my periscope. She monitored Sterling's internal communications, their construction reports, their financial filings. She built a shadow dossier on Madden's flagship project. The picture that emerged was one of hubris and haste. He was cutting corners. He was bullying contractors. He was fast-tracking permits through a city planning department where he had made significant political donations. He was building his monument on a foundation of arrogance. And then he made a fatal mistake. To clear the site for his grand tower, he had to demolish a handful of smaller, older buildings. One of them was a modest, 2-story brick structure on the corner of Linden Street. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't grand. It was just an old print shop. But it was the Linden Street print shop. In 1919, it had been the headquarters for the city's first major labor union, the site of a landmark strike that had changed the course of workers' rights in the state. It was on the National Register of Historic Places. It was a protected landmark. Madden's due diligence team, a group of young, overworked paralegals, either missed it or, more likely, were told to ignore it. Getting a protected building delisted is a long, public, and arduous process. It requires hearings, environmental impact studies, and proof that the building has no historical or architectural value. It's a process designed to be inefficient, and Madden hated inefficiency. Clara found the demolition permit in the city's public records. It listed the address, but it conveniently omitted the building's historical designation. It was a lie of omission, buried in a mountain of paperwork. She brought it to me, her face pale. "Esme, what do we do? We could leak this, we could stop him." I looked at the permit. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. For a moment I was tempted. One anonymous call to a friendly journalist at the city paper, and his project would be buried in lawsuits and public outrage. But that wasn't the plan. The plan wasn't to stop him. The plan was to let him sail his magnificent ship directly into the iceberg he had built for himself. "No," I said, my voice quiet. "We do nothing, we let him proceed." Clara looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and dawning understanding. "Some people," I said, "have to learn their lessons the hard way. He's holding the wrecking ball. All we have to do is stand back and let him swing it." So we waited. The Hearthstone group remained in the shadows. We finished the work on Blackwood Manor. We polished the floors, hung the chandeliers, and planted a garden full of the same flowers that had been in the original 19th century plans. We were ready. The first move had to be silent, but seismic. It couldn't be an attack. It had to be a revelation. Madden operated in a world of noise, press releases, media blitzes, shareholder calls. My world was one of quiet, deliberate action. He wanted to shout his value from the rooftops. I was about to let my work speak for itself. The restoration of Blackwood Manor was complete. It was, if I do say so myself, a masterpiece. The light streamed through the tall, wavy glass windows, illuminating the restored frescoes on the walls. The grand staircase gleamed. The air smelled of beeswax and old wood and fresh flowers. We hadn't just restored a building, we had resurrected a soul, Madden's strategy would have been a splashy, celebrity-filled grand opening. He would have hired a PR firm, blasted social media, and made sure every C-list influencer was there, taking selfies. That was his language. It wasn't mine. Instead, I made a few quiet phone calls. I didn't call travel bloggers or lifestyle magazines. I called the curators of the Met, the head of the World Monuments Fund, the architecture critic for the New York Times, a notoriously cantankerous man who despised modern corporate architecture. I called the president of the National Historic Trust. I invited them, and only them, for a private weekend-long retreat at the newly opened Blackwood Manor. No press, no cameras, just a quiet celebration of craft and history. The invitation was printed on heavy cardstock, with a hand-drawn sketch of the manor on the front. It was an invitation into a secret. They all accepted. That same week, as my small, exclusive group of guests were arriving at the manor, stepping out of their black cars and gazing up at the house with looks of quiet awe, the wrecking ball hit the Linden Street print shop. It happened on a Saturday morning. A cloud of red brick dust billowed into the downtown sky. It was brutally, shockingly fast. By noon, a building that had stood for over 100 years was a pile of rubble. Madden's team was efficient. I'll give them that. The explosion came on Monday. The head of the City Landmarks Preservation Commission, a woman I knew well from years of navigating her department, held a press conference. Her face was a mask of cold fury. She held up a photo of the print shop. She held up a photo of the rubble. She announced an immediate stop work order on the entire Sterling Grand project site and the launch of a full-scale investigation into the fraudulent demolition of a protected city landmark. The story was a nuclear bomb. It was on the front page of every paper. The evening news led with helicopter footage of the project site, now cordoned off with yellow tape, looking like a crime scene. Which of course it was. Clara was feeding me real-time updates from her old work computer. The office was in total chaos. Madden was screaming, not just at his legal team, but at everyone. He was blaming the paralegals, the project managers, the city itself. He was a cornered animal, lashing out in every direction. His lawyers were trying to frame it as a simple clerical error, a regrettable but honest mistake. But the narrative was already out of his control, and I was about to fan the flames. On Tuesday morning, the New York Times published its review of Blackwood Manor. The notoriously difficult critic didn't just like it. He raved. He called it a triumph of patient restoration over profitable destruction, and a powerful counter-argument to the cynical, soul-crushing glass boxes currently colonizing our cities. He described Hearthstone as a new and vital force in American hospitality. He didn't mention Sterling Hotels by name. He didn't have to. Then came the final beautiful touch. On Wednesday, the National Historic Trust, whose president was still staying at the manor, held an impromptu press conference from our library. With the gleaming, restored bookshelves as his backdrop, he announced that the Hearthstone Group was being awarded a special, unscheduled prize, the National Historic Trust Laureate for Preservation Excellence. He praised our unwavering commitment to architectural integrity and cultural heritage. Then a reporter asked him about the Sterling scandal. He adjusted his glasses and looked gravely into the camera. He said, "There are two ways to engage with history. You can be its steward, or you can be its vandal. In the last 72 hours, the city of New York has seen a breathtaking example of both. Checkmate." The contrast was brutal, devastating. On one side, Madden Sterling, the corporate vandal, surrounded by lawyers and bad press. On the other, Esme Thorne, the quiet steward of history, being feted by the most respected voices in the field. He had spent millions on a PR campaign to build his brand. I had destroyed it with a few well-placed phone calls and a commitment to doing things the right way. The fallout for Madden was immediate and catastrophic. His project was frozen indefinitely, mired in lawsuits from the city and a dozen historical societies. Protesters gathered daily outside his corporate headquarters. The Sterling brand, once a mark of sophisticated luxury, was now synonymous with corporate greed and cultural destruction. But the real damage was happening behind the scenes, in the quiet, carpeted offices of his lenders. As Clara had discovered, Madden's empire was built on a mountain of debt, specifically variable-rate construction loans tied to the Sterling Grand project. These loans had covenants, clauses that required the project to proceed on schedule and within a certain legal framework. The stop work order and the public scandal were a clear breach of those covenants. His creditors were getting nervous. The friendly bankers who had toasted his success at fancy dinners were now making terse, demanding phone calls. They had the right to call in the loans, to demand immediate repayment. Or, more devastatingly, they could sell the debt on the secondary market to investors who specialize in distressed assets. Madden was suddenly toxic. His company's debt was trading at a discount, and in Paris, Jean-Luc Dubois' family office, acting through a discreet and anonymous investment vehicle, began to buy it. All of it. They bought it quietly, in small parcels, through different brokers. By the time Madden's finance team realized what was happening, it was too late. A single, unknown entity now held the financial fate of Sterling Hotels in its hands. Madden didn't know who it was. He was fighting a ghost. He saw his stock price plummet. He saw his credit lines frozen. He saw his father's company, the legacy he had inherited and tried to warp into his own image, beginning to crumble. He was a man drowning in a sea of his own making. And that's when he reached for a life raft. He reached for me. The initial contact came through his lawyer, a man whose voice was as slick and polished as his Italian shoes. He called my lawyer. He said that Mr. Sterling was impressed with the niche brand I had built. He said that in light of the current public relations challenges, Sterling Hotels was interested in acquiring the Hearthstone Group. The idea was to absorb my good press, to buy my integrity and slap his logo on it. He thought he could buy my soul, just like he had tried to buy the Morellises. My lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Alani, listened patiently and then relayed the offer to me. I told her exactly what to say. A week went by in silence. I imagine it was a very long week for Madden Sterling. A week of frantic calls to his bankers, who were now legally obligated to direct him to the new debt holders' representatives, the sober, stone-faced lawyers at Jean-Luc's family office. A week of his own people feeding him terrifying rumors about a hostile takeover. The power shift was palpable. It wasn't just about one project or one scandal anymore. The entire industry was watching. The narrative had flipped. For years, Madden's philosophy of efficiency over everything had been seen as the future. Now, it looked reckless. My philosophy of patience and preservation had been seen as a charming anachronism. Now it looked like the only stable, long-term strategy. We started getting calls, not from journalists, but from city mayors and development councils. The city of Philadelphia called about the old Art Deco firehouse. They wanted to know if the Hearthstone Group would be interested in reopening discussions. The city of Detroit called about the abandoned post office. They were willing to offer significant tax incentives to a developer who would respect the building's history. These were the very projects Madden had sneered at. They were now flowing to me, not because I was poaching them, but because I had become the only safe pair of hands in the business. This wasn't an exodus of existing clients. It was something far more powerful. It was the complete redirection of future opportunity. The market itself was correcting, turning away from the noise and toward the substance. Madden hadn't just lost a building, he had lost the future. His desperation finally boiled over. He called me himself. No lawyers, no assistants. His voice, when I heard it, was almost unrecognizable. The smug, condescending baritone was gone, replaced by a tight, strained tenor. Esme, we need to talk. About what, Madden? About your company. My offer still stands. Let's be reasonable. I'll make you head of a new heritage division. You can have your passion projects. Name your price. It was an incredible display of ego. His empire was on fire, and he was still acting like he was the one holding the hose. He still thought this was about money, or a title. He still didn't understand the nature of the game he was in. This wasn't about revenge, I reminded myself. It was about restoration. My company is not for sale, Madden, I said, my voice calm and even. The line I had been waiting a year to deliver felt like ice in my veins. However, I believe yours might be. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Then silence. I didn't wait for a reply. I hung up the phone. The final confrontation wasn't a choice. It was an inevitability. Madden demanded a meeting. He wanted to meet on neutral ground, some sterile corporate boardroom downtown. I refused. I told him if he wanted to talk to me, he could come to Blackwood Manor. He could come to my ground. He arrived on a crisp autumn afternoon. The leaves on the old oak trees were turning brilliant shades of red and gold. He pulled up in his black German sedan, the car looking alien and aggressive against the soft historic lines of the manor. He got out, looking thinner, his expensive suit hanging a little loosely on his frame. The sneer was gone, replaced by a tight, anxious mask. I met him in the grand entryway. The sun was streaming through the fanlight. I let him rant. I let him spin his narrative of victimhood. He was a man who had never faced a consequence in his life, and now that one had finally arrived, he couldn't comprehend that he had authored it himself. When he finally ran out of steam, his shoulders slumped in defeat. I spoke. My voice was quiet, but it filled the cavernous space. You didn't need me to sabotage you, Madden. You were a one-man demolition crew. You demolished a landmark because you were in a hurry. You demolished your company's reputation because you valued greed over integrity. You demolished your father's legacy because you were too arrogant to understand what it was built on. All I did was build something better, next door. He stared at me, his eyes full of a dawning, helpless rage. The investment group that holds your company's debt is controlled by my silent partner, I explained calmly. As of this morning, due to the covenant breaches your scandal triggered, we have exercised our right to call those loans. Your board has been notified. You have two options. Option 1. We force Sterling Hotels into receivership. The company is broken up and sold for parts. The Sterling name is dragged through a very public and very messy bankruptcy. Your family's legacy becomes a case study in corporate malfeasance taught in business schools for the next 50 years. I let that sink in. I could see the blood drain from his face. Or I continued. Option 2. You want to save your father's name? You want this to go away quietly. You convene an emergency board meeting and you approve the sale of your family's controlling shares to my holding company. We will acquire the company for the price of its outstanding debt, a nominal fee. You get to walk away. You tell the world you're retiring to pursue other interests. Your father's name remains on the buildings he loved,